Now that spring training's here, it's time for a lot of fantasy baseball leagues to do their first-year player drafts. Here's the guys that I'm not leaving my FYPDs without.
You are Locked On MLB Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, welcome on in to Locked On MLB Prospects, your home for all things minor league baseball. I'm your host, Lindsay Crosby, award-winning baseball writer and podcaster, and thank you for making this your first listen every single day. We're proudly part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day, and today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Looking at fantasy baseball, this is not a strict fantasy baseball show. Most of what we do is real life prospects, right? We pay a lot more attention to defense than what fantasy does and things like that. But here in the spring, this is the time when most fantasy leagues do their first year player drafts. Not all of them. My home league was shortly after the MLB Draft is when we did our FYPD. And so international players were not signed yet, and they were not part of that draft. They'll come up next fall. And I feel like I got pretty good value on a lot of these guys because I was able to get guys before they shot up or down the boards in some cases with their post-draft performance. But the rest of my leagues have all been drafting this spring, and most of them are still scheduled. We haven't done those yet. But there's a couple commonalities that I've noticed in the guys that I have made a point to go out and get in all of my drafts. So let's talk about hitters here. We'll talk about pitchers next. And then at the end, I want to touch on some of the prospects that are coming up on the NFBC draft boards and redraft leagues, because you can learn some things about who's going where in those redraft leagues. So for the hitters, we know the top of the first round, right? Like we've figured out, we've established who's going to be in the top of the first round. We know that the first position player off the board in just about every draft is going to be Wyatt Langford because he's got absolutely stupid exit velocities, 107 miles an hour on his 90th percentile. Zone contact was 85%. He made it to AAA in his inaugural season and was a candidate to make the World Series roster as an injury replacement after they lost Adolis Garcia. That's how highly he was considered. He is the number one pick. You're probably not getting Wyatt Langford unless you're picking first overall. Some of the more common guys we see at the very top of that round kind of mirrors the MLB Draft last fall. Dylan Cruz, Walker Jenkins of the Twins, Max Clark of the Tigers. These are all kind of guys who are up there pretty high. The guy that I'm trying to not leave the first round without, assuming that I'm outside of those top 5 picks, right? And there's really 2 guys here that I'm paying attention to that I want. The first one is shortstop Colt Emerson of the Seattle Mariners. After getting drafted between rookie ball and A-ball, he got 114 plate appearances across 24 games. Colt Emerson bats .374, .496, .550. 2 homers, 12 extra base hits, 17 walks to 20 strikeouts, and 8 of 8 on stolen bases. And when you look at what Colt Emerson does on the baseball field and at the plate, you can see why he is desired so highly in FYPDs, because he's already doing a lot of things better than a lot of major leaguers. And granted, you have the whole, he's in the lower minors, but he was also a young player when he was drafted. He was age 17 when he was drafted. So he did a lot of this stuff before the age of 18 in professional baseball, okay? So in his pro sample, Colt Emerson makes 80% contact, overall 80% contact, 86% in the zone. And chase was easily above average as far as having good plate discipline and not chasing. It's like a 20% chase rate. Some of the numbers I think are a little bit misleading when you see, he only hit 2 home runs in 24 games. His exit velocities were really good. So 89 mile an hour was the average exit velocity for Colt Emerson. Right there at MLB average, right? 90th percentile exit velocity for Colt Emerson, 105. Now, remind you, everydayers have heard this a lot. MLB average for 90th percentile exit velo is 103 and change. So Colt Emerson, at the age of 17, was already showing better than MLB average power potential in the low minors. It's something where we saw him, he went 8 of 8 on stolen bases. The times on his 60-yard dash were in the mid to upper sixes, like 6, 7 or so. And so it's entirely reasonable to think that Colt Emerson, by the time he makes the majors, could be a plus hitter with potentially plus power. He's listed at 6'1", 200. I think he's a little bit bigger than that. But the point is, plus hitter, plus power. He could have plus speed if he maintains some of these times. Now, there is physical development to be done, so we don't know what's going to happen there. But it's entirely possible that he does. And then you combine that with an arm and hands and actions that should be good enough for him to stay on the left side of the infield. I don't know if he sticks it short. One, there are plenty of good, talented defenders in that Mariners system. And then two, it feels like his bat is going to be good enough where you're going to try to get him to the majors sooner rather than later. And it does take a little bit more time for the defense usually to stick at shortstop. You can see that with Jackson Holliday right now. And so, do you end up moving Colt Emerson to third base? Either way, Colt Emerson's a guy, if I'm outside of that top 5, I am trying to not leave the first round without a share of Colt Emerson. In my home league, again, we drafted soon after the actual draft. So before these guys really got play in the minors, I got Colt Emerson at pick number 30. There is no way I think Colt Emerson would fall out of the first round in any savvy league right now doing first-year player drafts. If for some reason I can't get Colt Emerson, the other guy that I'm going for, that I'm trying to see if I can get for a hitter in the first round, is Matt Shaw out of Maryland, who went to the Cubs. So 38 games, rookie ball, single A, high A. 357, 400, 618. 8 homers, 21 extra base hits, 9 walks to 25 strikeouts, and 15 of 18 on stolen bases. He played a lot of shortstop, but they tried him at second, they tried him at third, they tried him at DH. I don't know if the arm strength is there for third base, but the versatility is what could get him to the majors, and we've seen the Cubs not really care about arm strength at third base. I think you're in a position where you could see a guy that could have eligibility at third and at short and at second, given a full year in the majors, right? And again, he seems to be fast tracking to the majors right now. When you look at what he actually did as far as contact and power, right? Contact, 83% overall, 88.5% in the zone was what he did in college. You flip that to the majors, 85% contact overall. So it got better in the majors, despite the fact that he swung like half the time when he was more passive in college. He was more selective in college than in the majors, but he made more contact. And I think, like, you see his frame and you watch him play, he's listed at 5'11", 185, and he's seen as being like an average. He hit 24 home runs at Maryland, had 22 the year before that. But I think the power is maybe better than we give him credit for. 90th percentile exit velos of 107. And so, like, Matt Shaw, to me, could be a guy that could give you, again, above average to a plus hit tool, above average to plus power, as well as defensive versatility. He's not a like a blazer, right? He's not going to put up 60 run times, but he's going to be above average. He's going to be able to do some things on the base paths. Again, 15 of 18 last year in his sample. So if I don't have one of those top 5 picks, and I want a hitter in the first round, which is typically where I like to go, I am trying to not leave the draft without, or leave that first round without either Colt Emerson in the Seattle Mariners or Matt Shaw of the Chicago Cubs. Not time to go into all of the different guys that we like in the draft. Stay tuned, though. Next Friday, we're doing a show with our friends over at Locked On Fantasy Baseball. We're going to be talking about a lot deeper dive into the prospects that we like in fantasy baseball, both in FYPDs and prospects we want shares of in general. So stay tuned for that. In just a minute, we're going to look at some of the pitchers that I am trying to not leave an FYPD without. We'll do that next, right here on Locked On MLB Prospects. But first, today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Game Time. Trying to buy tickets to a concert, a sporting event, or whatever has the potential to be really stressful, right? When you are in a situation where all of these other ticketing apps try to get one over on you. Maybe it's the seats aren't as good as you think they are. The prices are higher than you think they're going to be. That's where Game Time really shines as a great app that has full and radical transparency, right? You get to see the view from your seat before you buy. You know exactly what to expect as far as sight lines, distance from the stage or the field or whatever it might be. They show you an all-in price up front, including all of the taxes, fees, and everything, so you know exactly what it's going to cost before you fall in love with those seats. You buy the tickets in seconds with 2 taps, and you get the Game Time guarantee. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less than what you paid on, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDON, LOCKEDON, for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, back to FYPDs and fantasy baseball, and some of the guys that I don't want to leave a first-year player draft without. When you look at the pitchers, there is a very obvious top 2 pitchers in the draft, and that's Yoshinobu Yamamoto and Paul Skeens. Yamamoto signing with the Dodgers, was the best pitcher in the NPB for the last, 5 years or so, had an ERA of just barely over 2. Through 171 innings last year, 193 the year before that. And it's despite being a diminutive for a right-handed pitcher, he's 5'10 or so. Fastball can touch 99. He's got a curve, a cutter, a splitter, tons of stuff to like, and he's on a team that obviously maximizes the effectiveness of their pitchers. Outside of that, Paul Skeens looks like one of the best pitchers we've seen since Steven Strasburg come out of college. Another dude who can touch 100 miles an hour deep into the game. I've seen him throw pitch 120 and it'd be 100 miles an hour. Has a slider, changeup as well. And honestly, if it's a points league, I could see Skeens being the number 1 pick. And usually I feel like pitchers are valued differently in points leagues. But outside of that, some of the guys that I'm trying to get, if you want to go pitcher in the first round, the guy that I, again, have prioritized coming out of all of my drafts with is Hurston Waldrop of the Atlanta Braves. I don't just say that because I am a Braves fan. I legitimately think he is a fantastic pitcher. 8 games last year, single A, high A, double A, triple A. He went all the way to Gwinnett in his first year. 1.53 ERA in 29 and a third innings. 41 strikeouts, so 12.6 per 9. To 16 walks, 4.9 per 9, and 1 home run allowed. That walk number is very similar to what he did in college. So it's right in line with his historic trends. He's always had a little bit more issue with walks than the average first-round pitcher that you would expect. Fastball sits 95, can run it up to 99. It's not amazing, but it's good. 16 or so inches of induced vertical break. It's right there where it needs to be, league average or so. But the big thing here is the splitter. Upper 80s splitter, separates off of the fastball, looks like the fastball halfway to the plate and just dives off the table, right? He's got a slider. He's got a curve. Curve's more of a vertical breaker. Slider has more horizontal movement. They're in similar velocity bands, about 3 or 4 mile an hour difference on those two. But there's a couple reasons here why he is going so high. One of them is proximity. Again, he made it to AAA last year, was I believe the only pitcher from the draft last year that made it to AAA. And is a non-roster invitee to spring training this year, and there's legitimate conversation that he has a shot at the 5th starter's job. I don't expect him to win it. I expect him to go back to start the season in Gwinnett, but the proximity is there. The ceiling of the stuff is there, and watch for what Atlanta does with him early this year. The Braves are known for pitching, one, developing pitching, too, but also taking a guy and temporarily shelving their curveball to focus on improving the slider and then bringing the curveball back. AJ Smith-Shawver rarely threw his curveball in 22, got the slider looking much better, brought the curveball back in 23, and added it into the arsenal. So if Waldrop's in the minors, look for them to prioritize and focus on improving the secondaries to make it even better. So you've got a guy that has a 70 grade pitch in the splitter, fantastic velocity, could dramatically improve his secondary pitches, I guess in this case his tertiary pitch in the slider, and then the curveball behind it. A lot to like there. In the second round, if you take a hitter in the first, like I suggested you do, Rhett Lauder of the Cincinnati Reds, I think is a great target in the second round, right? Did not pitch after the draft, after being drafted by Wake Forest. And it makes sense if you look at what he did. He went really deep in the year. Wake Forest obviously made it all the way to the College World Series, was going pretty late. Fastball sits mid-90s, 94 or so, but he does get a ton of lateral, horizontal movement on it, right? Like 17 inches of movement there. He throws it for strikes a ton. He also gets a ton of strikes with both the changeup and the slider. Changeup's really the thing that he's known for. A lot of those guys from Wake Forest do that with the Wake Forest pitching lab. And it sits mid to upper 80s. It gets a good 10 mile an hour or so difference. Ton of movement, right? Both induced vertical break in double digits and almost 1.5 foot of arm side movement. And great pitchability, great command, throws a ton of strikes. Cincinnati's going to push him. And yes, there's concerns about it's Cincinnati, it's Great American Small Park, but he has everything he needs. He's the type of profile of pitcher as far as avoiding hard contact, a lot of lateral moving things that it's hard to barrel up, that should succeed in a smaller park. And so I'm not as worried about where he went as I am a guy like, Chase Dollander going to the Rockies, right? Outside of that, if it's the third round and you want to take a pitcher, I know it's another guy with the same team, but I like Ty Floyd going to the Cincinnati Reds. Again, another situation where he's got good stuff, right? And specifically the fastball. The fastball for Ty Floyd is absurd. Sits 95. He gets like 20 inches of induced vertical break. It is amazing, like elite amounts of induced vertical break. But he also gets 10 or 11 inches of horizontal movement. So again, very hard to square up. Now, because of that, he throws the heck out of it, like 70% of the time, right? So you've got a changeup, you've got a slider, he's got to do more with. He has to develop them some more, and a curveball that he doesn't use a ton. But it's something where if it works out, his ceiling could be even better than Lauder's. If it doesn't work out, you're looking at a guy who could end up in the bullpen, but I still think would be a really good reliever. And he's a good pick. If you're somewhere around the end of the third round or so, you still want to grab a pitcher, I like the idea of grabbing Ty Floyd somewhere around there. If you want a prepster, everybody's going to look at the first two, both Miami guys, the first two prepsters that were taken last year, the best righty, the best lefty. Everybody's going to be like, yeah, give me a Thomas White, give me a Noble Meyer. But I'm looking right past that. If I want a prepster, the two guys I'm looking at are either Josh Noth of the Milwaukee Brewers in the later rounds or Blake Wolters of the Kansas City Royals. Two guys, I really like the stuff. I think Milwaukee especially is maybe a little bit underrated as far as a pitching development organization. So I'm going to get those guys. In just a minute, I've been looking at the NFBC boards, the ADP boards, to see where the prospects are going in redraft leagues. And there's a couple guys I noticed I want to talk about. We'll do that next, right here on Locked On MLB Prospects. But first, today's episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. It is the middle of NBA season right now. They just finished their All-Star game, which no defense to speak of. And so you can get buckets on your first bet with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. So it's $150 if your bet wins. You can use those proceeds to go over and look at the Rookie of the Year odds. Really interesting to see where some of these have gone. American League favorite, Evan Carter, plus 280. Jackson Holliday right behind him at plus 340. Wyatt Langford at plus 700. Followed by Colt Keith, Junior Caminero, and then Nolan Shanwell. Keith and Caminero at plus 1,000. Shanwell at plus 1,500. When you break down the National League Rookie of the Year, Yamamoto's number one at plus 180. Again, I say we probably should not have foreign professionals eligible for Rookie of the Year, but whatever. Jackson Chourio plus 850. Young-Hoo Lee of the Giants at plus 900. Followed by Shota Imanaga of the Cubs at 1,100. Noelvi Marte of the Reds at 1,100. And Pete Crow Armstrong at plus 1,800. So, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get your $150 in bonus bets today with FanDuel, the official sportsbook of the Locked On Podcast Network. And looking at redraft leagues here, it's really interesting to see where prospects are going on the redraft boards. Again, this is it. This is the National Fantasy Baseball Championship, NFBC. This is their ADP boards, which are just the results where players were taken in redraft leagues in the NFBC. I think they've done 525 of them, so it's a decent sample size. But this is for the full offseason. We don't have the full movement that's been made over the last couple weeks or so. The sample size isn't really enough to talk about. But looking at where guys are going overall, the first prospect off the board, kind of consensus, and it makes sense when you heard those Rookie of the Year odds, Yoshinobu Yamamoto is on average pick 51. He comes out as the 15th starting pitcher off the board, which means in 12-team leagues, he is just outside the starting pitcher 1 category. That would make him a high-end starting pitcher 2 in a redraft league. And it's fine. I think you're in a situation, we don't know what the adjustment period is going to be for Yamamoto. And I think we just all assume because he was so good that he's going to be incredibly good when he gets here. And he very well may be. I'm a little hesitant because I don't know how long that adjustment's going to take. We saw Kodai Senga have an interesting adjustment. He walked a lot of guys early when he got to the States last year pitching for the Mets, as he was adjusting to the baseball, as he was adjusting to the schedule, the better quality of the hitters. And Yamamoto may end up being Rookie of the Year when it's all said and done, but it just feels like that's maybe a little bit early for my blood on taking Yamamoto in the draft. Outside of him, you get a run on outfielders in the early half of the 100s. Evan Carter, Texas Rangers, is at 120 in NFBC championships. He's the ADP spot 120 right now. Jackson Chourio of the Milwaukee Brewers at 151. Both of those guys are expected to break camp on the team. Carter in left, who can move over to center, and Chourio in center field as the center fielder who's now gotten paid by the Milwaukee Brewers. Right behind Chourio, though, Wyatt Langford at 155, and that's the end of that second tier of guys in the early to mid 100s, right? And Wyatt Langford, we talked about him, amazing debut last year, made it all the way to AAA, was a candidate to make the World Series roster. We all assume he's going to break camp in the outfield, and he very well could be, but it feels like the ceiling is higher for Wyatt Langford, right? Because the power potential is absurd, but there's a little bit more risk there. And I think you see that when you see Evan Carter at 120 versus Langford at 155, is the more certainty you have behind Carter being able to stick because he did it late in the year. He did it in the postseason, right? I think he bet like 300 over the course of the postseason as they obviously went on to win the World Series. When you get to the 200s, there's another tier of a couple players in the early 200s, technically cheating. Jackson Holliday's at 199. Like we've been talking about, he's been doing a lot of work reportedly in spring at second base. And there was a really great piece, I think it was from Jay Cooper of Baseball America. He went back and watched like every defensive play of Jackson Holliday's that he could find last year. And you can see that the arm isn't quite ready to go for shortstop. He's getting it done, but it's definitely he's working around the arm versus being comfortable in the arm and its ability to make all of the throws that he needs to make. His positioning is a little bit interesting, and so he could get by at shortstop, I think, but I like him better at second base. Obviously, they do too. They're working him a lot at second base right now, and I think he eventually could be the starting shortstop for the Baltimore Orioles, but it looks more likely like he'll be the second baseman now. Shota Imanaga of the Chicago Cubs at 215. He's absolutely expected to win a rotation spot in spring training. And then Junior Caminero at 229. And this is the first one where I'm a little bit hesitant to think that he's going to break camp as the guy. I do think he's better than Isaac Paredes at third base. Obviously, they have Jose Caballero they traded for from the Mariners to play some short. They just signed Ahmed Rosario for like peanuts to play some short. And so there's options there. And it feels, just knowing how Tampa Bay does things, it almost feels like they're going to give those guys a shot first before Junior Caminero gets a chance to take one of those jobs. And look for him to probably, unless he's amazing in spring training, which could happen, look for him potentially to start off in AAA Durham and be a call-up at some point in time as injuries or ineffectiveness mean that they need him at the major league level. And again, I do think he can play shortstop. He got some starts there last year. I do think he could survive as a major league shortstop. Is he going to be a Gold Glover? No. I think he could be fringe to average defensively at shortstop. You might put in a better defender late in games, kick him over to third base, but I do think he can make it work at shortstop. Young-Hoo Lee of the Giants in center field at 265, and lefty Kyle Harrison at 270. Two Giants here. Feels like they're both pretty good locks to make the roster. And then in the 300 is where you get some of the spec picks, right? Jordan Lawler at 313. All indications are that he's going to start the year in AAA. That the Arizona Diamondbacks are perfectly content to have Geraldo Perdomo open the year as the starting shortstop. And unless you have some sort of injury to Eugenio Suarez or Perdomo, it's a question about what has to happen for him to get time at the major league level. You sign Jock Peterson as your DH. It's just, I don't know when you're going to see Jordan Lawler. And I think you can see some of that in his ADP numbers of getting kicked back to 313. Skeens at 325. Again, has a chance to break camp as the starter. Probably is not going to do it as a rotation member. Probably goes to AAA, I would assume, to start the year. But you could see him. And then Kyle Manzardo of the Guardians at 333. We've touched on this a little bit on the show before. But it is frustrating to see how many other options Cleveland has at first base and at DH over him. So like right now, if you look at it, Josh Naylor, obviously first base and DH. Devison De Los Santos was taken in the Rule 5 draft, so you got to keep him on the Major League roster. It's really questionable to see how do you get Kyle Manzardo on the roster on opening day. But I do think that, one, he's good enough, and two, De Los Santos, hitters rarely stick. Rule 5 hitters rarely stick at the Major League level. It feels like you could see him sooner rather than later. Colt Keith at 337 is a little bit of a surprise to me. I think some of this is because of pre-extension drafts where he was going a lot farther, but it feels like he has a better chance to break camp as the starting second baseman now. And then Pete Crow Armstrong of the Cubs at 340. Tyler Black of the Brewers at 360. That's a really interesting one to me. As far as a guy, hasn't debuted yet, a little bit maybe undervalued, can give you good speed from a corner infield spot, third or first, as well as good hitting ability. And then another one to watch for, kind of skipping over a few here, Michael Busch of the Cubs at 380. I really do believe Michael Busch is going to be the starting first baseman for the Chicago Cubs on opening day. Yes, they signed Dominic Smith. It was a minor league deal. Yes, they have Christopher Morel. He's going to DH. I don't like his defense anywhere. And yes, theoretically, Michael Busch can play third base, but he's much better as a first baseman. I still maintain I expect to see him as the opening day first baseman. And what should be a better lineup, a good run-scoring lineup, feels like 380 for him might be a decent value there. But then again, I will also admit, we saw the last first baseman they brought up, Matt Mervis, struggle last year. That's been a revolving door for them. And first base is a pretty deep position this year. Fantastic week this week. We're talking about some of the changes in the minor leagues and how that's going to affect players' livelihoods going forward, the roster size being reduced, the rescheduling of leagues, things like that. And then next week, after we do the Monday mailbag, the breakout prospects. We're talking about lower minors, upper minors, we'll talk hitters, we'll talk pitchers. Probably going to do a full 4 shows on it for breakout week. So send me your questions. Also send me your candidates for breakout prospects, and we'll evaluate that and throw them in the next week's shows. I'm on Twitter at Crosby Baseball. Show's on Twitter at Locked On Farm. We've got a Discord. We've got email. All of that stuff in the episode description in the show notes. Until tomorrow's show, remember, it's always a great time to pay a minor leaguer.